everybody, I'm Jason Kishinev. Welcome back to A People's Historian. This is Hermione. Each episode we read about 30 minutes out of a history book. We're reading chapter 21 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. And I'm going to start off by rereading a letter I read at the end of the last episode because I found it quite touching. Early in the Reagan administration, responding to the argument that government aid was not needed, that private enterprise would take care of poverty, a mother wrote to her local newspaper, I am on aid to families with dependent children, and both my children are in school. I have graduated from college with distinction, 128th in a class of over 1,000, with the BA in English and sociology. I have experience in library work, child care, social work, and counseling. I have been to the CETA office. They have nothing for me. I also go every week to the library to scour the newspaper help wanted ads. I have kept a copy of every cover letter that I have sent out with my resume. The stack is inches thick. I have applied for jobs paying as little as $8,000 a year. I work part-time in a library for $3.50 an hour. Welfare reduces my allotment to compensate. It appears we have employment offices that can't employ, governments that can't govern, an economic system that can't produce jobs for people ready to work. Meow. Last week I sold my bed to pay for the insurance on my car, which in the absence of mass transportation, I need to go job hunting. I sleep on a piece of rubber foam somebody gave me. So this is the great American dream my parents came to this country for. Work hard, get a good education, follow the rules, and you will be rich. I don't want to be rich. I just want to be able to feed my children and live with some semblance of dignity. Democrats often joined Republicans in denouncing welfare programs. Presumably this was done to gain political support from a middle-class public that believed they were paying taxes to support teenage mothers and people they thought too lazy to work. Much of the public did not know and were not informed by either political leaders or the media that welfare took a tiny part of the taxes. I didn't emphasize the right word. And military spending took a huge chunk of it. Yet the public's attitude on welfare was different from that of the two major parties. It seemed that the constant attacks on welfare by politicians, reported endlessly in the press and on television, did not succeed in eradicating a fundamental generosity felt by most Americans. A New York Times CBS News poll conducted in early 1992 showed that public opinion on welfare changed depending on how the question was worded. If the word welfare was used, 44% of those questions said too much was being spent on welfare, while 50% said either that the right amount was being spent or that too little was being spent. But when the question was asked was about assistance to the poor, only 13% thought too much was being spent, and 64% thought too little was being spent. This suggested that both parties were trying to manufacture an anti-human needs mood by constant derogatory use of the word welfare, and then to claim they were acting in response to public opinion. The Democrats, as well as the Republicans, had strong connections to wealthy corporations. Kevin Phillips, a Republican analyst of national politics, wrote in 1990 that the Democratic Party was history's second most enthusiastic capitalist party. Phillips pointed out that the greatest beneficiaries of government policy during the Republican presidencies of Ronald Reagan and George Bush were the super rich. It was the truly wealthy more than anyone else who flourished under Reagan. The 1980s were the triumph of upper America, the political ascendancy of the rich, and a glorification of capitalism, free markets, and finance. When government policy enriched the already rich, it was not called welfare. This was not as obvious as the monthly checks to the poor. It most often took the form of generous changes in the tax system. In America, who really pays the taxes? Two investigative reporters with the Philadelphia Inquirer, Donald Bartlett and James Steele, traced the path by which tax rates for the very rich got lower and lower. It was not the Republicans, but the Democrats, the Kennedy-Johnson administrations, who, under the guise of tax reform, first lowered the World War II era rate of 91% on incomes over $400,000 a year to 70%. During the Carter administration, though over his objections, Democrats and Republicans in Congress joined to give even more tax breaks to the rich. The Reagan administration, with the help of Democrats in Congress, lowered the tax rate on the very rich to 50%, and in 1986 a coalition of Republicans and Democrats sponsored another tax reform bill that lowered the top rate to 28%. Bartlett and Steele noted that a school teacher, a factory worker, and a billionaire could all pay 28%. The idea of a progressive income in which the rich paid at higher tax rates than everyone else was now almost dead. As a result of all the tax bills from 1978 to 1990, the net worth of the Forbes 400, chosen as the richest in the country by Forbes magazine, advertising itself as capitalist tool, was tripled. About $70 billion a year was lost in government revenue, so that in those 13 years, the wealthiest 1% of the country gained $1 trillion. As William Grider pointed out in his remarkable book, Who Will Tell the People? The Betrayal of American Democracy. For those who blame Republicans for what has happened and believe that equitable taxation will be restored if only the Democrats can win back the White House, there is this disquieting fact. The turning point on tax politics, when the moneyed elites first began to win big, occurred in 1978, with the Democratic Party fully in power and well before Ronald Reagan came to Washington. Democratic majorities have supported this great shift in tax burden every step of the way. Do yourself a favor. If you don't know what the Powell Memorandum is, go look up the Powell Memorandum. After the episode, of course, and after you hit the like and subscribe button. Not only did the income tax become less progressive during the last decades of the century, but the Social Security tax became more regressive. That is, more and more was deducted from the salary checks of the poor and middle classes, but when salaries reached $42,000, no more was deducted. By the early 1990s, a middle-income family earning $37,800 a year paid 7.65% of its income in Social Security taxes. A family earning 10 times as much, $378,000, paid 1.46% of its income in Social Security taxes. That's disgusting. The result of these higher payroll taxes was that 3/4 of all wage earners paid more each year through the Social Security tax than through the income tax. Embarrassingly for the Democratic Party, which was supposed to be the party of the working class, those higher payroll taxes had been put in motion under the administration of Jimmy Carter. In a two-party system, if both parties ignore public opinion, there is no place voters can turn. And in the matter of taxation, it has been clear that American citizens have wanted taxes that are truly progressive. William Grider informs us that shortly after World War II, when rates on the very rich were up to 90%, a Gallup poll showed that 85% of the public thought the federal tax code was fair. But by 1984, when all those tax reforms had been put into effect by Democrats and Republicans, a public opinion survey by the Internal Revenue Service found that 80% of those polled agreed with the statement, "The present tax system benefits the rich and is unfair to the ordinary working man and woman." By the end of the Reagan years, the gap between rich and poor in the United States had grown dramatically. Where in 1980, the chief executive officers of corporations made 40 times as much in salary as the average factory worker, by 1989 they were making 93 times as much. In the dozen years from 1977 to 1989, the before-tax income of the richest 1% rose 77%. Meanwhile, for the poorest 2/5 of the population, there was no gain at all. Indeed, a small decline. And because, did she just bite my knee? And because of favorable changes for the rich in the tax structure, the richest 1% in the decade ending in 1990 saw their after-tax income increase 87%. In the same period, the after-tax income of the lower 4/5 of the population either went down 5% at the poorest level or went up no more than 8.6%. While everybody at the lower levels was doing worse, there were especially heavy losses for blacks, Hispanics, women, and the young. The general impoverishment of the lowest income groups that took place in the Reagan-Bush years hit black families hardest, with their lack of resources to start with, and with racial discrimination facing them in jobs. The victories of the civil rights movement had opened up spaces for some African Americans, but left others far behind. At the end of the 80s, at least a third of African American families fell below the official poverty level, and black unemployment seemed fixed at 2.5 times that of whites, with young blacks out of work at the rate of 30 to 40%. The life expectancy of blacks remained at least 10 years lower than that of whites. In Detroit, Washington, and Baltimore, the mortality rate for black babies was higher than in Jamaica or Costa Rica. Now, along with poverty came broken homes, family violence, street crime, drugs. In Washington, D.C., with a concentrated population of black poor within walking distance of the marbled buildings of the national government, 42% of young black men between the ages of 18 and 35 were either in jail or out on probation or parole. The crime rate among blacks, instead of being seen as a crying demand for the elimination of poverty, was used by politicians to call for the building of more prisons. Ouch, ouch. The 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Education had begun the process of desegregating schools, but poverty kept black children in ghettos, and many schools around the country remained segregated by race and class. Supreme Court decisions in the 70s determined that there need be no equalization of funds for poor school districts and rich school districts. And the housing of children need not take place between wealthy suburbs and inner cities. The busing of children, excuse me. To admirers of free enterprise and laissez-faire, those people were poor who did not work and produce. and so had themselves to blame for their poverty. They ignored the fact that women taking care of children on their own were working very hard indeed. They did not ask why babies who were not old enough to show their work skills should be penalized to the point of death for growing up in a poor family. Ironically, it was Republican Kevin Phillips who, analyzing the Reagan years, wrote, "Less and less wealth was going to people who produced something. Disproportionate rewards to society's economic, legal, and cultural manipulators, from lawyers to financial advisors." In the mid-'80s, a major scandal began to emerge in Washington. The deregulation of the savings and loan banks, begun in the Carter administration, had continued under Reagan, leading to risky investments which drained the assets of banks, leaving them owing billions of dollars to depositors which the government had insured. As the years went by and the problem was kept behind a screen, it was going to take more and more money to pay depositors and bail out these banks. The figure began to reach $200 billion, billion with the B. During the 1988 presidential campaign, the Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis was restrained from pointing the finger at the Republican administration because the Democrats in Congress were heavily involved in bringing about and then covering up that situation. So the voters were kept in the dark. The enormous drain of money from the Treasury for defense had once been declared by President Eisenhower to be a theft from human needs, but it was accepted by both parties as Democrats competed with Republicans to show the electorate how tough they were. Jimmy Carter, as president, had proposed a $10 billion increase in the military budget, an enactment of exactly what Eisenhower had described. All of the huge military budgets of the post-World War II period, from Truman to Reagan and Bush, were approved overwhelmingly by both Democrats and Republicans. You think he's trying to say that both parties have the same policies? In many, many ways. Not all the same policies, but the same economic policies. Yes, indeed. The spending of trillions of dollars to build up nuclear and non-nuclear forces was justified by fears that the Soviet Union, also building up its military forces, would invade Western Europe. But George Kennan, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union and one of the theoreticians of the Cold War, said this fear had no basis in reality, and Henry Rositsky, who worked for the CIA for 25 years and was at one time CIA Director of Espionage Operations against the Soviet Union, wrote in the 1980s, "In all my years in government, and since I have never seen an intelligence estimate that shows how it would be profitable to Soviet interests to invade Western Europe or to attack the United States." However, the creation of such a fear in the public mind was useful in arguing for the building of frightful and superfluous weapons. For instance, the Trident submarine, which was capable of firing hundreds of nuclear warheads, cost $1.5 billion. It was totally useless, except in a nuclear war, in which case it would only add several hundred warheads to the tens of thousands already available. That $1.5 billion was enough to finance a 5-year program of child immunization around the world against deadly diseases and prevent 5 million deaths. In the mid-1980s, an analyst with the Rand Corporation, which did research for the Defense Department, told an interviewer in an unusually candid statement that the enormous number of weapons was unnecessary from a military point of view, but were useful to convey a certain image at home and abroad. If you had a strong president, a strong Secretary of Defense, they could temporarily go to Congress and say, "We're only going to build what we need, and if the Russians build twice as many, tough. but it would be unstable politically, and it is therefore better for our own domestic stability as well as international perceptions to insist that we remain good competitors, even though the objective significance of the competition is dubious. In 1984, the CIA admitted that it had exaggerated Soviet military expenditures, that since 1975 it had claimed Soviet military spending was growing by 4 to 5% each year, when the actual figure was 2%. Thus, by misinformation, even deception, the result was to inflate military expenditures. One of the favorite military programs of the Reagan administration was the Star Wars program, in which billions were spent, supposedly, to build a shield in space to stop enemy nuclear missiles in midair. But the first 3 tests of the technology failed. A 4th test was undertaken with government funding for the program at stake. There was another failure, but Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, approved the faking of results to show that the test had succeeded. Let's read that again. Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, approved the faking of results to show that the test had succeeded. When the Soviet Union began to disintegrate in 1989 and there was no longer the familiar Soviet threat, the military budget was reduced somewhat, but still remained huge, with support from both Democrats and Republicans. In 1992, the head of the House Armed Services Committee, Les Aspin, a Democrat, proposed in view of the new international situation that the military budget be cut by 2%, from $281 billion to $275 billion. And then he disappeared. No, I'm just kidding. That same year, as Democrats and Republicans both supported minor cuts in the military budget, a public opinion survey done for the National Press Club showed that 59% of American voters wanted a 50% cut in defense spending over the next 5 years. It seems that both parties had failed in persuading the citizenry that the military budget should continue at its high level, but they continued to ignore the public they were supposed to represent. In the summer of 1992, congressional Democrats and Republicans joined to vote against a transfer of funds from the military budget to human needs, and voted to spend $120 billion to defend Europe, which everyone acknowledged was no longer in danger, if it ever had been, from Soviet attack. Congressional Democrats and Republicans joined to vote against a transfer of funds from the military budget to human needs. When there was no need, there was no imminent attack, no threat. Democrats and Republicans had long been joined in a bipartisan foreign policy, but in the Reagan-Bush years, the United States government showed a special aggressiveness in the use of military force abroad. This was done either directly in invasions or through both overt and covert support of right-wing tyrannies that cooperated with the United States. And let's end the episode right there. And please do hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell, and tune into the next episode. We will read some more, and just think about how they when there's no threat, no imminent threat now, how do they keep up the military budget? Because they use the media to keep the people afraid, to keep the people nervous of this country or that country, and I don't want to mention specific things, but the media's involved in working for the government to keep up fear so that they can keep up their military budget. because they don't want to cut the military budget. And this is why we can't spend the military money on social programs, on human needs. And there I am getting political again. I thought about that and I decided that, you know what, this is political. And so, screw it. Tune in next time. We'll see you then. Thank you.